Welcome to the December 12th edition of Colorado Inside Out Postgame, a special web-exclusive production here on Channel 12. Let's get a quick take on Senator Mark Udall's comments this week about the CIA torture report that was released. Udall called out President Obama, along with CIA Director John Brennan, for covering up years of interrogation techniques that most consider torture. He called for Brennan's resignation and stated that President Obama needed to purge many of the CIA's highest officials and change the culture of the organization. Patty Calhoun from Westward, this was huge national news. It was just a gigantic story this week. And our own Senator Udall, outgoing Senator Udall, was right there in the middle of it. What do you think?
Well, he was right there in the middle of it. And I admired what he said this week. I wish we'd heard it from him during his campaign instead of having to hear about the war against women. If he had been talking about the issues with spying, with national security, in the way he spoke about them today, he might very well have been elected. And more to the point, if he had talked about them more last fall, when I know a year ago, when we were first talking about that on this show, maybe there would have been changes made a lot earlier. So it kind of makes you sad for what could have happened for both for the country and for Mark Udall's campaign.
David Copeland from the Independence Institute and DU Law School. What did you make of the report and the reaction from folks on both sides of the aisle?
Well, to focus on Udall, I'd echo Patty's sentiments that fine for what he did, but too little, too late. Mm-hmm. Could you imagine if he'd spoken out? If he'd blown he's in a unique position because by Article 1 of the Constitution, he can't be prosecuted for anything he does and says on the floor of the U.S. Senate. He could have been the one who blew the whistle on the NSA's massive, illegal, Orwellian spying on all the American people and much of the rest of the world. If he'd done that instead of Edward Snowden, then you wouldn't have had to have the guy who Obama drove into the arms of Vladimir Putin, taking a lot of U.S. state secrets, which maybe should be protected, with him. It's just he could have saved the country, really. He ran as a civil libertarian, and I think his caution on this was he was working behind the scenes sincerely, but if he just now figured out that Barack Obama is a liar, he's kind of naive and coming to this too late. Obama's not the only president who lies about stuff like this, but if Udall had called him on these lies much earlier, things would be a lot better in this country.
Eric Sonne, political analyst, what is this? I'm not sure I want to call it the finale, but at least for his Senate career, what does this mean for Mark Udall and his future that he goes out on this note? Is it a high note, or does it complicate issues with other future leaders?
Well, I think it's a high note given his passion around this particular issue. Now, he was prepared, or at least he was under a lot of pressure to go, if they weren't going to release this report, to use the mechanism that David referred to in his immunity from prosecution and basically read it into the record on the floor of the Senate, in the well of the Senate. He did not have to do that because Dianne Feinstein, the committee chair, and other Democrats decided to release the report anyway. So the focus was not quite as much on Mark Udall as it could have been if the cards had fallen elsewhere. I found the report very important, but I think you have to point out, without diminishing maybe the bottom line of the report, that it was also a flawed report in the way that they never went for comment to a whole lot of people who were involved in this. It was a fairly one-sided report. I'm not disagreeing with the conclusion necessarily, but as process goes, I think the process was rather pure. Everyone went running for their corners on this one, as with most issues these days, and the dichotomy became either, people would say this country shouldn't torture, or people on the other side would say, but the torture worked and we got valuable information. And both of those can be true. Yes, the torture could yield information, and you still have to make a value judgment of whether that's the business we should be in. My bottom line was not said by Mark Udall here, but rather by John McCain, who has a unique standing on this issue, having been tortured for 5 years in North Vietnamese prisons, who basically just said this is not about them being our enemies, the Islamists or whatever. This is about us and what values we hold dear and what we aspire to. And I think that summed it up from my point of view.
Penn Tate, attorney at Greenberg Traurig, also a longtime state lawmaker. Mark Udall's stance, we knew about it before. It kind of went away during the campaign, and now he finishes this way. What do you think that will mean for as we look back at his legacy?
I think Patty's right. I think had Mark made this a central part of his campaign platform and talked about these issues, he may well have had a different result, because this issue resonates with so many Americans. And I think it's for the reason that Senator McCain pointed out and Eric just echoed, this whole concept of torturing your enemies. It's not so much about what they're doing, it's about what we stand for as Americans. And clearly this is upsetting and justifiably so shocking, I think, for most Americans. I won't quite go where David does. I'm not going to equate Mark Udall with Snowden. I think one's a traitor and one's a U.S. senator doing his job and letting people know there's an issue. And I just wish, Mark clearly had some inkling about some of these things earlier on. I think he should have just been more aggressive. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, who else in the congressional body is aware of this information, or maybe more, and still is maintaining the code of silence?
Well, that's all the time we have for Colorado Inside Post Game this week. Leave us a comment, tell us what you think. For everyone here at CPT12.org, I'm Dominic Dezzutti. Thanks for watching.